Is the new and improved third-gen Ecodiesel engine actually a good engine? Well, today as a diesel mechanic, I'll tell you guys what I think. Welcome back to the channel, guys. Last week we took a deep dive into this second-gen Ecodiesel engine, 2014 to 2019, and we looked at why this engine had such a bad reputation and ultimately came to the conclusion that it was probably well-deserved. Today, we're gonna be looking at the highly requested third-gen Ecodiesel engine. Is it actually better than this second-gen? First of all, what we're gonna do is we're gonna take a look at all the upgrades from this engine, talk about the benefits. Secondly, we'll talk about some issues that have been associated with the third-gen Ecodiesel to this point. And then lastly, I'll give you my 2 cents, once again, whether or not I think it's worth you guys investing your hard-earned money into the third-gen Ecodiesel. So the third-gen engine was produced from 2020 to 2023, and it's putting out 260 horsepower as well as 480 pound-feet of torque, which is a really nice bump in power compared to this engine right here. In fact, that third-gen engine is putting out the most torque per liter of displacement at 160 foot-pounds of torque per liter. It's the most out of any engine in the segment. The only engine that's real close is the 2.7 liter Turbo Max from GM. However, that engine produces its peak torque at 3,000 RPM, and that third-gen Ecodiesel produces its peak torque at only 1,600 RPM, so almost twice as quick. And speaking of power gains, you're gonna get a really nice gain in towing as well. The third gen is now rated for about 12,500 pounds of max towing, up from 9,200 pounds in the previous generation. Fuel economy was also improved. This thing will get 32 miles per gallon on the highway, as well as a combined rating, city and highway, of 26 miles per gallon, which is pretty impressive, although the 3-liter inline-6 Duramax is still the efficiency king. But this Ecodiesel is not far behind. Overall, on paper, all very impressive. And without rehashing what I said last week, this second-gen Ecodiesel engine was, well, it was plagued with a lot of issues, and apparently Chrysler has put about 80% new componentry into this engine, so they've reworked it from the ground up. Let's take a look at what they've done and see the benefits of those updates. So the first thing I did, I wanted to see what Chrysler did about the bottom end issues in these second-gen Ecodiesel engines. As I said last week, that was the #1 issue that concerned me about this engine. And to me, when an engine has bottom end issues like that, it does point to just potentially a design flaw. The backbone of a good, reliable engine is having a strong bottom end and a strong rotating assembly. Without that, you really can't have a good, reliable engine. The third gen does come with an updated crankshaft with added fillets between the bearing surfaces and the counterweights, which just adds strength to the crankshaft, hopefully to deal with the flexing of the crankshaft we saw with this engine. That's what took out some bearings. Although, as I dug deeper into this issue, it does seem to point that there could be potentially a design flaw. This engine runs on very, very thin main bearings. Switching gears for just a second, let's take a look at the 3-liter diesel from Ford, aka the POWERSTROKE. That engine was first designed in the late 90s in England, and apparently VM Motori, who designed this Ecodiesel engine in Italy, followed the design of Ford's 3-liter diesel engine very closely, and apparently the bottom ends share a ton of similarities, including very thin main bearings. Now, it is pretty well documented while that 3-liter diesel engine from Ford was in Europe, it suffered from a ton of bottom end issues and bottom end failures. And before Ford brought that 3-liter diesel engine into North America, into their beloved F-150 lineup, they completely reworked the bottom end. They widened the main bearings from 16 millimeters to 20 millimeters, adding 4 millimeters of width. And it's just really interesting how both that 3-liter from Ford and the 3-liter from VM Motori, this Ecodiesel, share an extremely similar bottom end, and Ford's approach was to actually widen the main bearings. And interestingly enough, the main bearing width on these Ecodiesel engines is 16 millimeters, the same width of the original 3-liter diesel engine from Ford before they widened them. That also suffered all those bottom end problems. If I had to speculate, I would say that Chrysler did not want to undergo a complete engine redesign like what Ford did with their 3-liters in order to widen those main bearings. I would say that Chrysler has taken more of the Band-Aid approach to this bottom end issue, Things like changing the oil viscosity, changing the transmission software so that the engine doesn't lug as much, updating the crankshaft, as well as adding a bed plate to the 3rd gen engine as well to hopefully add some rigidity, but ultimately may not solve the root cause. I'm just a simple mechanic, I'm not an engineer, but when I did look into the bottom end issues on these Ecodiesel engines, that information did seem pretty interesting. What do you guys think? Do you think there's a design flaw, or do you think maybe there's another issue at hand? The good news is that the 3rd gen Ecodiesel engines are seemingly not having bottom end issues, so potentially that updated crankshaft is doing its job. Another important update which I like to see is the EGR systems being reworked on the 3rd gen. As I touched on last week, the 2nd gen Ecodiesel engine was plagued with EGR problems, and Chrysler has correctly addressed it. The 3rd gen EGR system consists of a high and low pressure setup. Sounds complicated, it's really not. On a traditional EGR system, all of that EGR gas is going to be sucked before the diesel particulate. It's going to be high pressure, it's going to be hot, and it's going to be full of soot and carbon. Pretty harmful when it goes back into the engine. This 3rd gen is going to suck some low pressure EGR gas, which means it's going to be sucking some of that EGR gas from after the diesel particulate filter, which means it's not going to have any carbon in it. So it's going to help eliminate some of that carbon from going back into your engine. So using this big Detroit diesel engine as an example, this is what we call a high pressure EGR system. So the EGR gases comes off right here, goes through the cooler and then back into the engine. As you can see, we pull the EGR gases basically right from the manifold. So this would be a high pressure system, high pressure gas. The gas is very hot and it's full of carbon and soot. The 3rd gens, however, are going to suck some gases after the diesel particulate filter, and well, we got the exhaust system all ripped up, and you guys can see there's just no carbon in this part of the exhaust system, and that's going to help eliminate a ton of carbon going back through the engine, hopefully solving a lot of issues that the 2nd gen Ecodiesel faced. Now the system is split between high and low, so there will still be some hot carboned up EGR gases going into the 3rd gen Ecodiesel engine. However, it should be a lot less than this engine and should lead to some good reliability and longevity in comparison again to this engine right here. The 3rd gen Ecodiesel will also be getting a new turbo with some low friction bearings in there. The earlier engines were known for having turbo failures. Also, with that high and low EGR pressure system that we just talked about, less gas will be robbed from the turbo, which means that the newer turbo will be able to produce more power, which we like to see. Chrysler also introduced a new larger SCR canister. An SCR, selective catalytic reduction, is used in combination with diesel exhaust fluid and it helps to eliminate NOx gases coming from these diesel engines. And I'll talk more about that in just a second. The aluminum heads on the 3rd gen engines have been reworked. The intake ports have been redesigned to allow more airflow into the combustion chamber. The aluminum alloy pistons have also been redesigned to give the 3rd gen engine a lower compression ratio than the 2nd gen engine. This 2nd gen engine has a compression ratio of 16.5 to 1. The 3rd gen is going to have a compression ratio of 16.0 to 1, so slightly less. And you might be asking yourself, why? Why would the 3rd gen have less compression? And it comes down to one reason: emissions. Lower compression ratio means that you emit less NOx gases. And if you remember, this engine was nailed by the EPA for emitting too many NOx gases. So I imagine with this updated 3rd gen engine, Chrysler has taken a very serious attempt to try and eliminate as much NOx gases as possible. I actually kind of like this approach from Chrysler, and I think they're painting a pretty clear picture of what they're trying to do. Traditionally, in order to lower NOx gases, which is what this engine probably did after the EPA recall or software update, is basically just stuff more EGR gas into the engine, and that will naturally lower NOx gases. But there's a lot of problems with that. This engine is a perfect example. Carboned up everything. EGR cooler fails, intakes fail. It's not a good solution, but it does lower NOx gases in order to be emission compliant. So what Chrysler is doing here is they are using, like I mentioned, other componentry to try and eliminate NOx gases without having to put carboned up EGR gas through the engine, because at the end of the day, it just makes these engines less reliable and the longevity goes when you have a ton of EGR gas full of carbon going through the engine. So I kind of like Chrysler's approach. The pistons have been redesigned to lower the compression ratio, but they also are going to be featuring thinner piston rings. That's going to help lower the internal friction of the engine, as well as the wrist pins in the piston have been slightly offset. Apparently that's going to help with piston slap, as well as, again, helping to lower internal friction in the engine, just allowing for more efficiency and more power to be made out of this engine, which is always a good thing. So those are some of the updates to the 3rd gen engine that I thought could be beneficial. I like where Chrysler is focusing their energy on the 3rd gen. Hopefully it translates to the real world in some reliability. But no engine is perfect, and the 3rd gen Ecodiesel is no exception. So let's jump into the dark side here and talk about some of the issues that have been known with the 3rd gen. Firstly, this engine comes with a full set of emissions like any modern diesel engine, so it is vulnerable to emission component failure as well as engine derates pretty much at any time, something that a gasoline engine just does not have to deal with. The first specific issue with this 3rd gen Ecodiesel that caught my eye was a number of people reporting just random low oil pressures in their 3rd gen engines. This is pretty worrying because any engine that's not getting proper oil pressure is going to fail pretty quickly or very quickly. Well, there does not seem to be a root cause that I could put my thumb on. There's been a number of reports of the oil filters just not being installed properly, and apparently that can dramatically impact your oil pressure. Not completely sure on this issue just of yet. Maybe you guys can clue me in a little bit, but I couldn't really find a root cause as to why, but I did hear and see a lot of people complaining about low oil pressure in their 3rd gen Ecodiesel engines. Another issue with these 3rd gen Ecodiesels is the fuel pumps kind of blowing up. These engines run the Bosch CP4 fuel pump. I don't really like those fuel pumps at all. Those fuel pumps were in the 2011 to 2016 LML Duramax engines, and they imploded on a ton of those engines, took out the whole fueling system, and it was a disaster on the Duramax side of things. There was huge class action lawsuits, and I would not trust a CP4 fuel pump as far as I could throw it. Even the Ram 2500 and 3500 with the 6.7 Cummins used the CP4 fuel pump in 2019 and 2020 before they threw it in the garbage because, again, it was just blowing up, causing a ton of problems. They went back to the CP3 fuel pump, which was a good decision. This Ecodiesel, well, what do you expect? There were reports of the CP4 fuel pump blowing up, and it wasn't long. In, I believe, October of 2022, Ram released a recall for the CP4 fuel pumps. The recall consisted of about 60,000 3rd gen Ecodiesel engines, and the reason why is because, well, the pumps would explode, take out the fueling system, and they would shut down the truck, which was deemed a safety hazard on the road, and I can't blame them. Another issue with the 3rd gen engines that I hate to see is reports of EGR cooler problems. The 2nd gen engines were absolutely plagued with EGR cooler issues, and it's just not a good sign that the 3rd gens are also dealing with that. Now, I will give Chrysler a little bit of a benefit of the doubt because to me, it's a little bit more of an industry-wide thing. I changed EGR coolers on Detroit diesels, Cummins. I've done a number of both engines in the new year already. It just kind of comes with the territory. Unfortunately, you run that hot EGR gas full of soot through those coolers, and over time, things start to fail. Overall, I do think it is a far superior engine than the 2nd gen. I think it's far more reliable, but would I spend my money on it? Honestly, I would probably say no. If I was looking for a fuel efficient pickup truck, which is what these engines are designed for, is fuel efficiency, I would either look at the 2.7 liter EcoBoost from Ford, or if you had to go diesel, I'd look at the 3 liter inline 6 from GM. I think that's also a very good, well-built engine. I would probably pass even on the 3rd gen Ecodiesel if it was my own money, if I'm gonna be honest with you guys. It's just so hard to win with a modern diesel engine. I think manufacturers are so concerned with being emission compliant, which they should. We all saw a couple months ago what happened to Cummins when they weren't. A nice little $2 billion slap on the wrist there. So there is real penalties for not being emission compliant. So I think that's the number one concern of manufacturers. Number 2 would probably be profitability, if they can even make money off the engine. Number 3 is probably reliability. So reliability slides way down the list when it comes to making these modern diesel engines, and that's why I just personally would not want to be investing in this 3rd gen engine. I think GM has done a very, very good job with their inline 6.3 liter. They've somehow made a relatively reliable engine while still being emission compliant so far, and hopefully they're making some money off of it. So that's my thoughts. I think the 3rd gen Ecodiesel engine is a relatively solid engine. I think if you own one, if you spent money, you should be most likely just fine with it. Anyways, guys, I hope you like that little Ecodiesel engine series there. Unfortunately, this is a shop truck, so I can't really strap a trailer behind it, but we'll see what we can do in the future. If you guys did like the video, don't forget to leave that thumbs up. And if you like cool stuff like this, don't forget to subscribe because, well, we'd love to have you on board. Anyways, enough of me. We'll see you in the next freaking video.